All right. Welcome everyone to the Kubeflow Pipelines community meeting. Today's date is February 26, 2025. This meeting is governed by the CNCF Code of Conduct. The meeting is recorded and will be uploaded to the Kubeflow YouTube account after the call has ended. So typically we start with introductions for anybody who's new. Anybody in the call that's new that would like to introduce themselves? I don't see anyone. All right, let's keep going. So next topic, I have SDK release. Chen, do you have the bandwidth to do an SDK release? We haven't
Yes,
had one in a while.
actually, I wanted to do a securities as well. We have a change waiting, so I can
Yeah,
do, I think, as early as tomorrow or even today.
yeah,
Uh,
that sounds good.
do we have any like outstanding PRs we are waiting for?
I think it's anything that's waiting. Let's do that for the next SDK release. I think
Okay,
it's been pretty long. And if you're willing, the one after this one, I would love to attempt it.
sure.
Maybe we
Yeah,
can
I
work
think
through
we
the
should talk about the credential sharing part.
yeah. I'll reach out when
Yeah.
that time comes. Awesome. So the 2.4 release, there are some regressions that are they're basically on the backend side. The PRs have been put in. We would like to get these in for the next Kubeflow release. I'll cut a release probably tomorrow for it. If not, if I don't get to tomorrow, then Friday. Hopefully I can do it by tomorrow though. It's a busy week. Any questions, comments, concerns about that? All right. Um, API changes. So Chen, we had a bit of a back and forth in one of the PRs that is waiting. And so I think I get the gist of how the order in which they happen. So if you'd let me just say it out, let me know if that's consistent with how you see it, and then we can
Mhm.
talk about it. So my understanding is you first do the API changes. So that's just changes to the pipeline spec. So none of the functionality implemented in the SDK or anything. And this is true for Kubeflow platform and for the SDK, right? So that
Yes.
would be its own PR.
Mhm.
Okay, and that gets merged. Then there's the backend implementation, right?
Mhm.
So before the SDK functionality has gone in, you put in the backend changes and those get merged.
Mhm.
Okay. Now this part, it needs to go out in a release.
Yes.
Okay. So the backend, so it has to be a full KFP release with the backend underlying changes. And then we add the SDK functionality, that PR gets merged, and then we do an SDK release. Is that the right
Yes.
flow?
Yeah, that I think that's the right order. I think in you may combine the proto API chain with backend change
Right.
together because API chain itself doesn't go anywhere.
Mhm.
But I think just for like breaking down a PR, not like include everything. I think usually this is how we structure a change. Yes.
Okay. And there was also some discussion about like we want to have backend changes first, because what is the point of adding SDK functionality if like you can't do anything with it, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Um, so one thing that kind of I feel like this makes it feel like there's a lot of overhead on adding any new API changes. And not only that, when we do a KFE backend release, there's release notes that go out, but we can't include them until we do like an SDK change, right? So that's when the feature is properly released in Kubeflow pipelines.
Yeah.
I don't have a good solution, but I feel like I see this as a problem. What does everyone think?
I think there's a raised hand from Matt.
Matt,
I just want to clarification on the SDK functionality. Like, if it's backwards compatible, is it okay to include all in one, or like? I guess I'm thinking of the case where you have to opt into using the new feature.
Yeah, I think that's the context for this PR we are discussing is you introducing a new field, user can opt in, but once they opt in, they there's no way to go. The backend will just error out, right? So
it's
it's
actually
not like
worse. So
ready for opt-in yet. it gives you a hallucination. Some feature is ready, but in reality, it's nowhere.
And we deprecate a field too. So it's like
Mhm.
it's like the opt-in is the non-deprecated version in this scenario, which doesn't seem right to
Yeah.
me. I don't know. I So I my when my in my response I said that we can make it a hard requirement that like we release SDK with the backend and then make it that when you introduce an API change, you have to provide the backend implementation and it all goes as one. I think this reduces a lot of overhead, but it puts then if you're downstreaming this and your implementation's coming in your downstream backend first, and you don't like that, you might see that as a like an overhead, unnecessary overhead. So
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't see other solution. I think this is required. Also, as I think I explained in the PR comments, in the past we do things not
yeah.
ideally, but that's because of the Vertex backend. We have a much faster release cadence. We can do basically we release on a weekly basis.
Mhm.
And when Google was like driving both is whether we hold the Vertex feature release for waiting for some Kubeflow open source release. That's always the challenge I got from my leadership. Right? Why? So
So I guess I would
going forward, I definitely like to see we follow the backend change goes in first, and then SDK change
okay.
follow the go. Yeah.
So is that like we're in agreement there that um we should we should have a commitment on backend changes along with the API changes. Uh, and if we want to have these things faster, like we can do full KFA releases more frequently. I don't have a problem with that. I don't care if like we do a minor release every 2 weeks, right? We can fix up the automation and solve that problem that way. It's not a big deal. Um,
Yeah, I personally think that's the right thing to do.
okay,
Also want to mention the SDK release is not SDK release is the from user perspective, SDK upgrade is fairly easy. If you do only a patch release, they might just update the day you release it, right? And then they get all the new changes that backend is not ready yet. That's
but that's
I
the
guess
issue, right? Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
I guess I was looking to clarify. It's like if they upgrade the SDK and the YAML being produced is the same, so they have to opt in to using the new feature. But as long as they don't change their Python code, it produces the same YAML. Is that okay to release an SDK with that without the backend
Uh,
change released?
Put it behind a feature flag kind of thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. Yeah,
Huh.
and like probably only document it once the backend is released.
Yeah, I think we did that in the past for those Vertex features. I think when we release some features in, we explicitly have this documentation in Kubeflow website. This feature is not available in Kubeflow yet,
I get
which
really
sounds
annoyed by that.
ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
don't know where is this available. I think only Vertex users know, but
Okay.
that's
I
not ideal for the community for the open source. I think.
so how would we feel if the ideal that we strive towards is we do backend releases more frequently, we couple the SDK and backend releases, and any PR that's adding API changes also needs to
Mhm.
come with a backend change. It does that Is that reasonable?
Yes, I think just not necessarily to couple the releases because backend even we release user may take some time to upgrade their deployment. SDK is just has a much easier
Right.
upgrade path.
Okay, so at the very least, commit to a backend change. And if we want the backend changes as yeah, we can still do it more frequently, just not couple them. Matt?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering if like release branches help with this, so that we could continue like having patch releases of the SDK with bug fixes, but have like these new features queued up and then release the SDK and the backend at the same time. I guess, is there a specific reason for the SDK, like the minor versions, as in the Y in the version, the SDK and the backend to be released at different times? Like as a user, it'd be kind of nice if they were the same version, so I would know I'm using the same SDK version with the same backend version.
Yeah, I think the versioning was also a challenge we had. It's just SDK changes tends to go faster, and both release from our side and upgrade from user side are much easier. I think what we settled was we don't force the minor version and patch version to be the same. We just, as long as the same major version, like 2 point something, then in general, backend and SDK are compatible.
Well, I don't think that's true,
Ideally,
right?
maybe they should share the same minor version entities. Maybe patch version can be different.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at.
Okay, do we have agreement there that we would, when we're doing a new SDK minor, that has to be coupled with, so the minor releases have to be coupled together. They don't have to be the same versioning right now. Like we don't have to like start renaming the versions to catch them up, but we can start with having like the next I mean, we'll do this SDK release, but the next SDK release for the minor release will need to go out with the KFP backend. And what are thoughts there? Does anything need to happen before we get to that ideal? Do we need to like increase the cadency of the backend releases?
It does seem like major and minor matching is a good thing that we should strive for.
Yes, I'm just thinking from user. If I have a, like for example, SDK 2.10 and the SDK backend 2.9, are those compatible? They should.
Yeah, old SDK would be compatible, but newer SDK than the backend would not be.
But like by definition, minor should be compatible, right? Only major
Well,
can introduce breaking changes.
no, I'm saying like if the SDK is older, then it will always work with a newer, as long as the major version matches. But you can't use a newer SDK on an older backend because you might have added new fields in the SDK that are not compatible, right? That's how we operate kind of today anyways. Like a KFP 2.4 might have new functionality that the SDK shows that wasn't in 2.0.
Okay, so going forward, if we want to share the same minor version, we should maybe next KIP backend release should catch up, right? Because I think SDK is more advanced in terms of the minor version.
Catch up.
We like skip like 2.5 something. I think SDK is 2.13 or something. What's the current SDK version?
You mean align the naming, the version, so like have
the
KFP,
minor version. Do we want to?
I think that
2.11 is the SDK one.
Yeah.
I think that before we do this, we should fix up the automation to make backend changes like as close to one-click release process as we can.
Okay.
Because SDK right now is super easy to release and backend isn't, in my opinion. So, but I think it'd be nice to get an agreement on this is what we want. So we are agreed that we want to first catch up the backend versioning to the SDK versioning, and then we want to couple the minor releases, right? And we are agreed on Matt's points here, where older SDK would work with newer backends, and newer SDK does not necessarily work with older backends.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Yes, I think
Okay.
that's good.
Okay. Automate backend releases to make it as easy to release as SDK. Couple SDK minor with backend minor. So before that would be KFP 2.6 would need to be whatever the latest SDK is, right? Does that make sense? Okay, good. Now another problem. In my adding of this new field in these changes, I found out that every time we add a new proto field, it actually it'll break in the older driver. And so this goes to, so I guess with Matt's point, if we are fine with newer SDKs not working with older backends, then this is not a problem. But I've introduced a PR where going forward, it's not going to be as big of an issue. It'll just ignore the new fields. So even if you're using the SDK with new fields, it will be able to at least compile it. It'll just drop the new fields. And then whatever error you encounter after that is subject to runtime. So
yeah, actually, I have a comments on this PR. I just saw this morning. I feel like we probably should be not like generalize this for all the unmarshals. In general, if you have an unknown field, maybe it's the right thing to do is to fill to
Yeah,
give
my
some.
opinion. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
I feel like it should be a case by case whether we ignore unknown fields, but not like apply to all the unmarshal code.
Yeah, I agree with that. I didn't realize the API server had those changes as well. Like the API server, in my opinion, should reject the unknown fields, but the driver and such, it's okay. Because at that point, the API server has declared that this is valid.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Can you drop a comment there? I'll revert the changes specific to API and everything else that stands out. But this problem exists for anything pre. So I'll fix this before I do a patch release. So at least in 2.4 we will have this functionality, but pre 2.4 this is, if you add a new field, the driver will break.
Okay.
All right, that's enough of my topics. Thanks everyone. I mean, I'll have one more later, but Ricardo, do you want to?
A second. I think this one will be quick. Just finishing our TTL discussion. I just posted again the documentation on our proposal to implement TTL for pipeline runs. I think we all agreed on how to do CRD cleanup. But I believe the last open question we had in the documentation is what to do with the database cleanup, if we should add a parameter that users will choose to clean up both CRD and DB if they want, or if we should make everything as a default, or we just skip database cleanups at all. So that's our final decision before we finalize this feature. Just to say, the CRD cleanup task, PRs is already there. I believe for now it's not a blocker to merge them, because after all, this is what is what the feature originally was implemented with. And if we need more time to discuss about the database cleanup, we can also agree on that. I just want to make sure that we are not blocking anything about that specific discussion.
Matt?
Yeah, at least my opinion, the database cleanup should be opt-in or not an option, because the database is supposed to be like something that you can refer back to and audit. And so keeping that in historical information is important, but I realized that cleaning up the CRs in Kubernetes is a requirement just because of etcd can't handle that many objects. But all the information anyways is stored in the database, so I don't see a problem with pruning those.
Yeah, this statement was echoed also by Alex from Capital One in the previous meetings as well. I think there's agreement there. The only concern I think Chen you had in the past was that like it might be misleading, that we're doing it for just the under the hood like cost resources and not like the pipeline itself. User might think when we set TTL, they're deleting the run, and it will, if it's in the database, it will still show up. I don't know where we left off with that. I know we followed up, and I think we were fine to proceed with as is.
Is it a naming issue?
So what would it look like? So that basically you have a config, and in the config you set TTL. So that's what the user sees, right? Right now it seems like set TTL on what the run is what I would think. So what when you as a user when you do this, what are you expecting to get cleaned up?
Yeah, probably need a different name.
Yeah, so something that implies it's under the hood resources that are being cleaned up if we want to maintain the agnosticism.
Set resource TTL would be fine with me.
I see Chen nodding.
Yeah, maybe I think yeah, I think that works for me. I also I don't really have strong opinion on the naming. I think maybe even documentation would be fine.
Yeah, okay. No, I think I feel similarly as long as we document it.
Mhm.
We'll want to document what exactly is being cleaned up. The naming here may not be explicit enough.
Well,
But
I disagree. I think we should have something very specific, because then if you want to have other TTLs later on, like you're just going to be keep adding weird flags in the set TTL function. So I think make it very specific, set resource TTL or similar. So if you add the
Yeah,
database cleanup later, it would be a separate TTL perhaps.
yeah, I thought about that as well, because if in the future we decide that we want a database cleanup, we could just have another set database CTL, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense.
but then you might get the implication that this is like a broader set TTL on everything. I think it's low, like it's a reasonable request if we can proceed with just like an explicit naming. It's would be an easy change, and then but we should still document it too, right? Because resources also is not super explicit. And we should document what is being cleaned up.
And that's
Under
specific to each backend, right?
Yeah.
It's
In
so
our upstream documentation, I think we can just, I think it's safe to say Kubernetes, like Kubernetes pods are being cleaned up or what have you. Okay, cool. Any other, so besides that, it seems like we're all on the same page. We're okay with having this. We're okay with, so let's just, I guess, make that change and we can proceed with start merging things in the order that makes sense. Right? So, Matt.
yeah, I don't know what the formal process is, but I'd like to have backend approval access if possible. I feel like I've been pretty involved in the community, doing a lot of code reviews, a lot of code contributions. Would like to be considered.
Yeah, I love the comment. I'm super happy to endorse Matt. He, like you said, he's been extremely involved in various discussions, PRs, contributions. So I would say if Chen has a +1, I think that's sufficient. Just feel free to make a PR, Matt, and ping me, and we can merge it.
Okay, thank you.
In the same vein, I have created some nominations from some of the Capital One folks that have been actively involved with upstream KFB in the various SDK/backend areas. So they have a +1 for me. Chen, you can take a look.
Sure.
Yeah,
I think that works.
okay.
Maybe you can combine AdMed to the same PR, I guess. Up to you.
Okay. I think that makes sense. If Matt, you are willing to be a reviewer in these component areas as well, that would be great. Or if it's just backend, I don't know where where we want where you're proposing.
I can be a reviewer for the API, but maybe just approver for backend for now.
I think I've seen you involved in there, so API makes sense to me. And backend makes sense to me. Okay. I can add you there. That's fine. I'll update the PR after the call. All right. That's in the agenda items. Anybody have anything they'd like to bring up before we end the call?
Just a public service announcement that the KEP for the Kubernetes native API that I presented a couple of times ago got merged. So implementation is starting on it. And just as a reminder, it's opt-in and fully backwards compatible when you do opt-in. So yeah, so if you have any further comments on it, now's the time, I guess.
Awesome. Thank you for that. It was very thorough and we got a lot of involvement and discussion there. So appreciate everybody's inputs. Another PSA, a not so nice one, our tests for SDK execution are still very, very flaky. We have some volunteers, I think, that are looking into it. It continues to be a bit of a pain. Suspicion is that it has to do with the parallelization of the SDK execution test. I'm not sure, but yeah, if your PRs get stuck on SDK executions, feel free to DM me on Slack. I'll rerun those tests while we get this sorted. Cool. Anything else? Going once, twice, thrice. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you all next time. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.